63% of the US as of today. Wow. When you start thinking there is no future, you go into what we call learned helplessness, a place where you just kind of give up. And if you get to that place of giving up, then you have no power over your life. That's when people get depressed. That's when people do crazy, stupid things. That's when people want to turn to drugs or alcohol or sometimes suicide or just total frustration and anger, and their life starts to do the opposite of a breakthrough. It becomes completely stuck and in pain or in ongoing suffering. If you and I are going to break out of that, we got to see it as it is. We're not here to be positive thinking people. You got to see what's really going on. But if you're overweight, you can't say to yourself, well, I'm big boned. That's not why you're overweight. You're overweight because you don't work out, you eat certain things, you eat Cheetos all day long, watching TV. I don't know what it is you do, but I know it's not just because you're big boned. You don't want to make it so it's outside your control or you can't change it. So see it as it is, but don't see it worse than it is so that you have no reason to try. Does that make sense? That's the first step. Step 2, get to the real truth and deal with it. Don't just see it as it is and not worse than it is. Don't just like balance it, but now get to the truth. I mean, listen, if the truth is you've been trying to get a job for 2 years and you truly have worked every day in a particular industry, and the number of jobs in that industry has shrunk down, and you really aren't getting that job, then you might have to look at the truth. The truth is you might have to retool. You might have to say, gosh, you know, the industry I'm in is gone. I mean, gross simplistic example, but for years, vinyl records were around for 85 years. It was a gigantic industry. And things came and went. During the vinyl record time, what happened? Well, remember those 8-track tapes? Are you ancient enough to remember those things? Maybe you know somebody remembers those things. These big boxes, you push them in and out. Yeah, 8-tracks came and went, vinyl records were still here. And then cassette tapes came, right? And cassette tapes were smaller and more compact and more convenient and more seemingly indestructible. And they came over here and vinyl records were still selling like crazy. If you had a job in vinyl records, you kept it. But then a little thing came along called the CD. And when that happened, almost overnight, you saw an entire industry that had been around almost a century was gone. If you were the guy that worked in the vinyl record factory and knew everything about it, it was the second generation, didn't matter. It was over. And now we laugh about a CD, right? Because everything in this digital world you can have instantly. Who wants to put on a CD? Pretty rare, still available. In vinyl records, maybe there's a small market of people that are collectors, but it's gone. My point is, if you're in the vinyl record business, you got to tell yourself the truth. You got to see it as it is, not worse than it is, but you also got to get the truth and deal with it. You got to deal with the cards you're dealt. You're going to have to retool. You're going to have to change something. You might have to move. If you live in the Gulf, and I don't support anything that's happened there, who could? It's unconscionable what's happened with BP. But if you live in the Gulf and you're a third-generation fisherman, and you fish for oysters, and they're dead, you better get to the truth. Are they going to be dead for 2 years or 10 or 20 to the best of your ability? And you might say, well, I can't do anything else. I can't. I'm a third generation. This is all I know. Yes, you can. Get to the truth and deal with it. Deal with the card you're dealt with. You got to deal with it, sure, I'm sure legally, but in the meantime, you got to take care of your family. I'm not saying this off the cuff easy because I've been in those situations where it's impossible, it's unjust, it's wrong, but I still got to deal with it just like you. Am I making sense? It's like, you might say, I have lived here, Ma. You might have to move. You might have to fish someplace else. You might have to, I know you still got to deal with all the consequences, but you got to take back control of your life. There are unjust things that happen, but you got to take control. Easy for me to say, I'm not sitting in your shoes, I get that. But who hasn't experienced some form of injustice? Someplace. Who's not dealt with something unfair? Who's not dealt with something that wasn't meant to be unfair, but it affected your entire life, your career, your finances, whatever? You got to tell yourself the truth, and you got to get to those, dealing with the reality right now. The longer you wait, the longer the crisis will be. If you're having an economic crisis, got to deal with it. Got to downsize, right size, do whatever it takes. And I say, okay, Tony, well, so far you're telling me don't allow myself to make it so bad I don't try, see it as is, but don't make it worse than it is. And you're telling me get to the truth and deal with it. Well, that's nice, but how do I do that? Maybe the third step, more than just getting the role model, maybe to be more specific, is get a vision first. Get a vision and get strong. That's what I think your third step should be. You first tell yourself the truth, yes. See it as it is, not worse than it is. Tell yourself the truth and deal with it. But the way to deal with it is say, what am I going to go for? There's got to be a compelling future. I got to come up with a vision for my life or a vision for my relationship. I've had terrible relationships, nothing's worked. Tell yourself the truth. I've made poor choices, or I told myself stories and gave myself excuses, or I've not had the courage, whatever it is. Get to the truth, and then get yourself a vision for what you do want. Because you have to have something you're going to move towards. Does that make sense? Without a vision, people perish. It says in a very good book called The Good Book. I know there are many good books, but that's a good one to take a look at. We need something to go for. We can deal with any problem today as long as there's something that we can look for in the future that we can strive for. It'll give us the emotional and psychological fuel, the juice, to keep moving forward. So you gotta come up with a vision, and a way to do that, we'll call that step 4. Get a role model. You might get the vision from a role model, you might get the vision just from coming up with a new idea. But in order to figure out how to go from where you are to where you want to be, to close the gap from where you are to where you want to be, it's best to learn by other people's experience whenever you can. So get a role model, get their strategy, and go to work. Get into action. So I'll give you an example. Years ago, when I was first starting to try to figure out how to build myself financially, I grew up at a time when, just as I was starting to do well, this big recession happened. And I remember I was like 29, 30 years old, I think, and maybe 31. And I was doing okay, and then all of a sudden there were all these business challenges because we went through this severe recession back in those days. And I remember at the time everybody was downsizing and freaking out, and I thought, you know what? I don't want to just settle for this. I want to find a way to do well. Who's done well in really tough times? And so I started doing my homework. And in those days, you didn't go out and use the internet the way you do today. You couldn't access all that information. We actually went to libraries and did research in traditional ways. I'm ancient enough to remember those days. And I started hearing about this man named Sir John Templeton. Very famous man. He's a man who became a multi-billionaire as an investor. He started with nothing. But what was interesting is when I started to find out about his story, because here's a guy that when he's a young man, he's called Sir John Templeton now. He was actually an American originally, and he wasn't Sir. He came from a very poor family, and he just decided that in his life, he wanted to not only do well financially, he wanted to do so well he could help other people at any level that he wanted. And today, by the way, he's passed, but before he did, he created the Templeton Fund, and he also created a fund that now delivers money, gives money each year, the Templeton Prize, to people that do good spiritual works, and it's larger than the Nobel Prize, and it continues to go on. The guy started with nothing, and here's how he did it. Listen to me now. The reason I look for him as a role model is because he made all his money in the worst of times. He made all his money when people were going through the equivalent of the deepest recession or depression possible. His whole belief was, and this is different than almost anybody else you see around you, was pessimism was the secret to success. That what he wanted to do was make money when people were most pessimistic. Because when people are optimistic, they want you to pay for their house a huge sum of money. But as they start getting more and more pessimistic, well, pretty soon they think they can never, if the house is the worst thing to have, they'll virtually give you the house. They'll virtually give you the business. And so he made all his money starting in World War II. When the war broke out, when Hitler invaded over in Europe, he took all the money he had and borrowed total money of $10,000, total amount. He bought with $10,000 every stock on the New York Stock Exchange that was $1 or less that he thought might be useful, including some companies that looked like they're going to be bankrupt. But he did it when people were the most pessimistic. Because if you recall, it looked like Hitler was going to take over. It didn't look like we were all going to be the winners. It looked like Hitler was going to dominate. And when people were that scared, they would give up anything they had just to get a little bit back. And so he bought all the stock that eventually made him a multi-billionaire. He became a billionaire because after things changed, after the war, just 5 years later, and the economy started to surge, everything changed for him. Where do you think he invested next after World War II? Where was a country that was pummeled, that was down, the factories were basically turned into mud? Japan. You could buy things for pennies in Japan that would have cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars before, and he did. When everyone was most pessimistic, he went and did well. And then he sold when the 80s surged and when everybody thought Japan was the greatest country on earth and had the biggest businesses. He sold and made his maximum profit when people were overly optimistic. He did the same thing down in South America when inflation went crazy. This man spent his entire life basically having a strategy of how to succeed when everybody else was scared. I tell you that because he's a role model. What he did, how he did it, it's all in writing, it's crystal clear. You could do the same. But you won't be able to do it when you're telling yourself the sky is falling and it's over. When you see it worse than it is, you'll just give up. You won't do it if you don't tell yourself the truth is, you know what, this system isn't working. I got to do something. I got to change my finances. I got to change my job. I got to reach. If you don't tell yourself the truth and deal with the truth, the real truth, nothing's going to happen. You won't ever even think about a guy like John Templeton if you don't have a vision that says, I don't care how the environment is, I'm going to find a way to do well. And you won't do well unless you get a strategy based on a role model who's really done it. My whole thing is this: if anybody has something you want, they aren't lucky. They did something. If you model them, if you take similar steps, you can produce a similar result. Make sense? And then finally, the fifth step, look, if you're in a situation where you see it as is, but not worse than it is, if you told yourself the truth and you dealt the cards you're dealt with and just decided you're going to change it, and you're willing to do what's necessary. If you put yourself in a place where you got a new vision and you've gotten yourself strong, if you got a role model and you've got some strategy and you've got yourself into action, step 5 is give much more than you expect to receive. Simple as that sounds, if you find a way to meet people's needs in business, in an intimate relationship, meeting your kids' needs, anybody's needs, the whole game changes. What happened here when all of a sudden, Melissa finds herself coming home and all of a sudden she finds out that while she's gone, her kids now don't want to talk to her boys, her husband has had an affair. Well, none of that could change if she would have just said, you know what? My whole life is over, I'm done. And oh, by the way, I've just lost my career too because while I'm busy trying to deal with my family, I didn't finish the record, so I lose my record deal. And oh, by the way, we don't have any financial stability, now we're losing our house. If that family would have just said it's over, if Melissa or Rick either just said it's over, it would have been over. But they told themselves the truth. We got severe problems here, but they didn't make it worse than it was. They didn't say we can't turn it around. And then they got to the truth of the infidelity, the truth of her addiction to going after fame instead of being a mom, the truth that neither one of them had been really competent at parents and had not given the energy to the kids that they deserved. The truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off. The truth it doesn't feel good, but not feeling good is sometimes where you get your drive to change things. They started looking around and said, we don't have the skill to even manage our house, much less our finances. We got to do something different. We got to focus on our kids. We got to focus on turning things around. We got to turn our relationship around. But that wouldn't have worked unless they got a vision of starting to see, it could happen. And that's what I helped them with. I helped them get to the truth. I helped them to stop over-exaggerating. I got them to a place where they got to see that this relationship could be back alive and passionate, and that these kids deserve both their parents, and that she really could be a great mom, and that maybe in the end she could even still have her singing career and enjoy it too. That she didn't have to give it all up. And I'm really proud of her. She did it because she found a role model. She got a vision, but she got a full role model. And the man that she works with today is a man that sold, I think now 5 million or 10 million records. And most people outside the country business don't know his name. He's her mentor now. He's made music with, Willie Nelson, with just about anybody you can imagine in the business. And he's done it for all these years, but he's never left the central part of Texas because that's where his family is. And Melissa's had offers to go to Sony Red. She walked away because they said, you're gonna have to do these things without your family. She found out what was most important, and she made the decisions that met her needs to be a great mom. When you fight life and go, I should be a singer and not a mom, when you got 5 kids, you got a problem. When you fight life and say, the economy should be different, you're gonna be stressed. Deal with what is, without exaggeration, with total honesty, dealing with the cards, coming up with a vision, finding yourself a role model that shows your strategy, work your tail off, give, keep changing your approach, and you can get where you wanna go.